双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
Honore de Balzac by Albert Camus and Louis Lumet. Translated from the French by Frederick Taber Cooper. General note. Of all the books, perhaps the one best designed for training the mind and forming the character is Plutarch. The lives of great men are object lessons. They teach effort, devotion, industry, heroism, and sacrifice. Even one who confines his reading solely to biographies of thinkers, writers, inventors, poets of the spirit, or poets of science, will in a short time have acquired an understanding of the whole history of humanity. And what novel or what drama could be compared to such a history? Accurate biographies record narratives which no romancer's imagination could hope to rival. Researches, sufferings, labors, triumphs, agonies and disasters, the defeats of destiny, glory, which is the sunlight of the dead, illuminating the past, whether fortunate or tragic, such is what the lives of great men reveal to us. Or, if the phrase be allowed, paint for us in a series of fascinating and dramatic pictures. This series of biographies is accordingly intended to form a sort of gallery, a museum of the great servants of art, science, thought, and action. It was Emerson who wrote a volume devoted to the representatives of humanity. Here we have still another collection of representative men. This collection of profoundly interesting studies is entrusted to the care of two writers, Mr. Albert Camus and Mr. Louis Lumet, both of whom have already earned their laurels. The former as poet, novelist, playwright, historian and philosopher, and author of a definitive work upon Helvetius, which deserves to become a classic, and the latter as publicist, art critic and scholar of rare and profound erudition. An acquaintance with the successive volumes in this series will give ample evidence of the value of such able collaborators. On the mountain tops we breathe a purer and more vivifying air. And it is like ascending to a moral mountaintop when we live, if only for a moment, with the dead who, in their lives did honor to mankind, and attain the level of those whose eyes now closed, once glowed like beacon lights, leading humanity on its eternal march through nighttime towards the light. Contents. Chapter 1. The Treatise on the Human Will. Chapter 2. The Garret. Chapter 3. His Apprenticeship. Chapter 4. In Business. Chapter 5. The First Success. Chapter 6. Dandyism. Chapter 7. The Foreign Lady. Chapter 8. At Les Jardins. Chapter 9. In Retirement. Chapter 1. The Treatise on the Human Will. At Balzac's Funeral. The glorious yet bitter seal upon his destiny. Victor Hugo delivered a magnificent address, and in his capacity as poet and seer proclaimed with assurance the judgment of posterity. His life has been brief, yet full, and richer in works than in days. Alas, this powerful and indefatigable worker, this philosopher, this thinker, this poet, this genius has lived amongst us that life of storms, of struggles, of quarrels, of combats, which has always been the common lot of all great men. Today we see him at peace. He has escaped from controversies and enmities. He has entered, on the selfsame day, into glory and into the tomb. Henceforward, he will shine far above all those clouds which float over our heads, among the brightest stars of his native land. This discourse was admirable for its truth, its justice, and its far-sightedness. A golden palm branch laid upon the author's tomb, around which there still arose clamors and bitter arguments, denying the greatness of his works, and rumors which veiled the features of the man behind a haze of absurd legends. A star of his country, he certainly was, as Victor Hugo proclaimed him, one of those enduring stars which time so cruel to others fails to change, except to purify their light and augment their brilliance, to the greater pride of the nation. His life was indeed short, but it was one which set a salutary example, because, stripped of idle gossip, It teaches us the inner discipline, the commanding will, and the courage of this hero who, in the midst of joy and sorrow alike, succeeded in creating an entire world. Honore de Balzac was born at Tours on the 20th of March, 1799, on the ground floor of a building belonging to a tailor named Dameret,
in the Rue de l'Armée d'Italie,
number 25, now number 35,
Rue Nationale.
The majority of his biographers have confused it with the dwelling which his father bought later on, number 29 in the same street according to the old numbering, and the acacia, which is there pointed out as having been planted at the date of his birth, really celebrated that of his brother Henri, who was several years the younger. Although born in Touraine, Balzac was not of Touranian stock, for his birthplace was due merely to chance. His father, Bernard François Balsa or Balsa, came originally from the little village of Naguère, in the commune of Montserrat and district of Albi. He descended from a peasant family, small landowners or often simple day laborers. It was he who first added a C to his patronymic and who later prefixed the particle for which the great novelist was afterwards so often reproached. Bernard Balsa, born July 22, 1746, left his native village at the age of 14 years, never to return. What was his career? And what functions did he fulfill? Honore de Balzac says that his father was secretary to the Grand Council under Louis XV, and Laure Serville, his sister, wrote that under Louis XVI he was attorney to the council. He himself, in an invitation to the marriage of his second daughter, Lawrence, described himself as former secretary to the King's Council. During the Revolution, he was secretary to the Minister of the Navy, Bertrand de Malleville, and later was director of the commissary department in the 1st Division of the Armée du Nord, stationed at Lille. It is impossible to follow him through all the different wanderings necessitated by his functions, but it is known that upon returning to Paris, he there married the daughter of one of his superior officers, Salambier, attached to the Ministry of War and, at the same time, director of the Paris hospitals. At the time of the marriage, January 30, 1797, he was 51 years of age. His bride,
Laure,
was only 18, a young girl possessed of culture, beauty, and distinction of manner. The first fruit of this union was a son, who, although nursed by the mother, died at an early age. Through the influence of his father-in-law, the elder Balzac obtained in 1799 the direction of the commissary department of the 22nd Military Division, and installed himself at Tours, where the division was stationed. In the early months of the same year, François soon had a reputation throughout the province. He was a sort of philosopher and reformer, a man with ideas. He despised the currently accepted opinions, and proclaimed his own boldly, indifferent to the consternation of his fellow townsmen. A large head emerging from the high, thick collar of his blue, white braided coat, which opened to disclose an ample cravat, a smooth-shaven face and florid complexion, a powerful chin and full cheeks, framed in short, brown mutton-chop whiskers, a small mouth with thick lips, a long, straight, slightly bulbous nose, an energetic face lit up by black eyes, brilliant and slightly dreamy, beneath a broad, determined forehead overhung with stray locks of hair, gathered back in the fashion of the Republic. All these features proclaimed a rugged personality, a dominant character, conspicuously at variance with the placid bourgeoisie of Touraine. François Balzac had furthermore an agreeable presence and a self-satisfied manner, and it pleased him to boast of his southern origin. The citizens of Tours spoke of him as an eccentric, but he was greatly annoyed when the term reached his ears. For, good Gascon that he was, and proud of himself, body and mind, he felt that it was singularly humiliating to be treated with so little respect. In point of fact, he was quite justified in refusing to accept an appellation which, however well it might fit his manners as a well-intentioned fault-finder, caustic and whimsical in speech, in no way applied to his unusually broad and penetrating intelligence. teeming with new and strictly original ideas. He was a disciple of Rousseau. He held certain social theories, and he was unsparing in his criticisms of existing governments. He had his own views as to how society at large should be governed and improved. The first of these views consisted in cultivating mankind by applying the method of eugenic selection to marriage, in such a manner that after a few years there would be no human beings left save those who were strong, robust, and healthy. He could not find sufficient sarcasm to express his scorn of governments which, in civilized countries, allowed the development of weaklings, cripples, and invalids. Perhaps he based his theory upon his own example. François Balzac had the constitution of an athlete and believed himself destined to live to the age of 100 years and upward. According to his calculations, a man did not reach his perfect development until after completing his first century. And, in order to do this, he took the most minute care of himself. He studied the Chinese people, celebrated for their longevity, and he sought for the best methods of maintaining what he called the equilibrium of vital forces. When any event contradicted his theories, he found no trouble in turning it to his own advantage. He was never, related his daughter,
Madame Laure Surville,
in her article upon Balzac, under any circumstances at a loss for a retort. One day, when a newspaper article relating to a centenarian was being read aloud, an article not likely to escape notice in our family, as may well be imagined, he interrupted the reader, contrary to his habit, in order to say, enthusiastically, "There is a man who has lived wisely and has never squandered his strength in all sorts of excesses, as so many imprudent young people do." It turned out, on the contrary, that this wise old man frequently became drunk, and that he took a late supper every evening, which, according to my father, was one of the greatest enormities that one could perpetrate against one's health. "Well," resumed my father imperturbably, "the man has shortened his life. No doubt about it." François Balzac was not to be shaken in his opinions. Furthermore, he was not satisfied with asserting them in the course of conversation. But in spite of his lack of confidence in the influence of books upon prejudiced readers, for he considered that the sole exception was the reaction against chivalry brought about by Cervantes's Don Quixote, he wrote a number of pamphlets in which the vigor and originality of his mind are revealed. He published successively an essay regarding two great obligations to be fulfilled by the French, 1804, an essay on the methods of preventing thefts and assassinations, 1807, a pamphlet regarding the equestrian statue which the French people ought to raise to perpetuate the memory of Henry IV, 1815, the history of hydrophobia, 1819, etc. In the first of these works, François Balzac proposed that a monument should be raised to commemorate the glory of Napoleon and the French army. Might that not be almost called the origin of the Arc de Triomphe? The singularities of François Balzac in no wise hurt him in the estimation of the inhabitants of Touraine. He served as administrator of the General Hospice from 1804 to 1812, and introduced there a practical reform in providing remunerative work for the old men. As an attaché of the mayor's office, he had the mayoralty offered him in 1808, but he refused it in order to consecrate himself entirely to the sick and convalescent. At Tours, the Balzac household led the life of prosperous bourgeois folk. The father had acquired a house with grounds and farmlands. The Balzacs entertained and were received in society. People enjoyed, perhaps with some secret smiles, the unexpected outbursts of the husband, and they liked him for his kindly ironies which had no touch of malice. As for the subtle and witty Madame Laure Balzac, who had preserved all the graces of the 18th century, she was found delightful by all those whom she admitted to the honor of entering her circle of acquaintances. She was a young woman of distinguished manner, with a somewhat oval face and small, delicate features, overcast at times with a shade of melancholy. She had a somewhat distant manner which she redeemed by a gesture of charming welcome, or a gracious phrase. She was pious, but without bigotry, a mystic whose religion was that of St. John, all gentleness and impulse. She read Swedenborg, St. Martin, and Jacob Boehme. She had an ardent and untrammeled imagination, but her character was firm. Her decisions were promptly taken, and she knew how to enforce their execution. She was a woman of principle. She respected social rules and customs and demanded that the members of her family should observe them. 4 more children were born to this marriage. 2 sons and 2 daughters. Honore,
Laure,
Lawrence, and Henri, all of whom had widely different destinies. Laure became the wife of an engineer of bridges and highways, Midi de la Grenere-Serville, and was intimately associated with the life of her older brother, whom she survived down to 1854. Lawrence died a few years after her marriage in 1821 to M. de Montsegal.
Henri,
The youngest, went through divers ups and downs, but finding himself unable to achieve a position of independence, he finally went into exile in the colonies. Madame de Balzac's first son having died, as was thought, in consequence of the mother's attempt to nurse him herself, Honore was placed with a nurse in the country district outside of Tours. He remained there until 4 years of age, together with his sister Laure, and it is there, no doubt, that they formed that tender and trusting friendship which never wavered. When he returned to the paternal roof, Honore was a plump, chubby-cheeked little boy with brown hair falling in masses of curls, a contented disposition and laughing eyes. People noticed him when out walking in his short vest of brown silk and blue belt, and mothers would turn around to say, "What a pretty child." Honore was impulsive, with a heart overflowing with affection, but the training he received at home was rigorous and severe. Entrusted to the hands of servants, under the high and mighty surveillance of his governess,
Mademoiselle
Delahaye, he received from his father, who was already an old man, nothing more than an indulgent and often absent-minded affection.
Wow.
As for his mother, she carried out with great firmness her theories regarding the relation between children and parents. She received hers each evening in her large drawing room with cold dignity. Before kissing them, she recapitulated all the faults they had committed during the day, which she had learned from the governess, and her reproofs were reinforced with punishments. Honore never approached her without fear, repressing all his feelings and his need of affection. He suffered in secret. Then he would take refuge with his sister Laure, his only friend and comforter. Before he was 5 years old, he was sent to a day school in Tours known as the Leguay Institution. He had a taste for reading. Indeed, it was more than a taste. It was a sort of mental starvation which made him throw himself hungrily upon every book he encountered. Otherwise, Honore was frankly a mediocre and negligent, but concentrated in himself and deprived of the caresses which would have meant so much to him. He created a whole world out of his readings and sometimes gave glimpses of it to Laure by acting out before her dramas and comedies of his own manufacture and of which he was the hero. His exuberance made him a good comrade, yet he also loved solitude. When alone, he could give himself up to the fantasies born of his own imagination. And he invented his own games, and used to play upon a cheap toy violin made of redwood airs which he enjoyed to the point of ecstasy, and of which no one else could bear the sound. At the age of 8 years and some months, on the 22nd of June, 1807, Honore entered a college school at Vendôme. It was an institution celebrated throughout the districts of central France and directed by the Oratorian Fathers. Prior to the Revolution, cadets used to be trained there for the army, and it had preserved the military severity of its discipline. After their admission, the pupils were never allowed outside vacations and never left its walls until their course of study was terminated. Honore lived there until April 22, 1813, and in Louis Lambert he has described his sufferings, his hopes, and the tumultuous and confused awakening of his genius. Throughout those long years of convent-like imprisonment, he had passed from the cold discipline of the family circle, which had nevertheless been tempered by an atmosphere of kindliness, to the hard and impersonal discipline of the college school. The warm-hearted and melancholy child must needs undergo this second severe test. and he was destined to come out from it in a state of self-intoxication, a bewilderment of dreams and ideas. The college buildings, surrounded by walls, contained everything that would seem calculated to render existence laborious and gloomy for the students. The latter were divided into 4 sections: the minions, the smalls, the mediums, and the greats, to which they were assigned according to the grade of their studies. For diversion, they had a narrow garden which they could cultivate and a cabin. They had permission to raise pigeons and to eat them, in addition to the ordinary fare. The classrooms were dirty, being either muddy or covered with dust, according to the season, and evil-smelling as a result of crowding together within narrow spaces too many young folks who were none too clean and to whom the laws of hygiene were unknown. The masters were either overbearing or neglectful, incapable of distinguishing the individual from the crowd and concerned only with seeing that the rules were obeyed and discipline maintained. The pupils themselves were often cruel to each other. It was here that Honore de Balzac formed his own character. Alone, and suffered alone. Sensitive and repressed child that he was. From the very first months of the sojourn in the College of Vendôme, he was classed among the apathetic and lazy pupils, among those of whom nothing could be made, who would never be an honor to the school that trained them and could be ignored excepting for the purposes of punishment. Honore had an insurmountable aversion for all the required tasks. He was indifferent to the charms of Greek themes or Latin translations, and history alone had the power of stirring him and awakening his appetite for knowledge. He was habitually sluggish and stupid in the eyes of his masters. But what a formidable, unknown work was going on in the brain of this child. We may picture him in the classroom, during study hour, leaning on his left elbow and holding an open book with his right hand, while he rubs his shoes one against the other, with a mechanical movement. What is he reading? Morality in action and an example. His obscure desires are taking definite form. To become a great man, a hero, one of those whose names are transmitted from age to age. Such from choice will be his own destiny. He seizes his pen and rapidly writes Balzac, 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 over all the white margins of the book on morality. This book passed into the possession of M. Jules Clertay. Then once more he leans upon his elbow, gazing out of the window at a corner verdure which he can just glimpse, and forthwith he is off again in one of his interminable reveries. The harsh voice of his teacher interrupts him. You are doing nothing, M. Balzac. The boy falls back from his dreams into the classroom. The reproof has hurt him keenly. He fixes his magnetic black eyes upon the teacher. Is it bitterness, disdain, or anger towards him for having destroyed those fruitful meditations? At all events, the teacher feels something like a shock. He says, If you look at me like that, M. Balzac, you will receive the ferule. The ferule, the thong of leather that cut so painfully when it fell with dreaded rhythm. 1, 2, 3, on the tips of the fingers or the palm of the hand. Punishments rained heavily on Balzac, the bad pupil, who seems to have been perpetually in disgrace over his tasks and lessons. These punishments included the extra copying of lines in such numbers that he has been declared the inventor of the three-pointed pen. And then there was imprisonment in the dormitory, the wooden breeches, as it was called in the college, and where he remained for weeks at a time. Whether he suffered from these punishments and from the contempt of his teachers, Honore at least never complained, for whatever left his mind free to follow its own self-cultivation was a welcome opportunity. He had a tutor, the librarian of the rich Oratorian library, who during those rare recreation hours, when he had no extra lines to copy, was supposed to give him special lessons in mathematics. But by a tacit agreement the teacher paid no attention to the pupil, and the latter was permitted to read and carry away any books which took his fancy. In point of fact, no book seemed to him too austere or too repellent or too obscure for his youthful understanding. He absorbed pell-mell works upon religion, treatises of chemistry and physics, and historical and philosophical works. He even developed a special taste for dictionaries, dreaming over the exact sense of words, the adventures that befall them in the course of time, and their final destinies. The absorption of ideas through reading had become, in his case, a curious phenomenon. So Honore de Balzac has recorded in Louis Lambert, in which he is painted in the person of his hero, his own formative years in the college school of Vendôme. His eye would take in 7 or 8 lines at once.